Chapter 40. Bert finds a clue. When he heard that a mail coach had reached the heart of Showville, Spittleworth seized a heavy wooden chair and threw it at Major Roach's head. Roach, who was far stronger than Spittleworth, batted the chair aside easily enough, but his hand flew to the hilt of his sword, and for a few seconds the two men stood with teeth bared in the gloom of the guard's room, while Flapoon and the spies watched open-mouthed. "You will send a party of dark-footers to the outskirts of Showville tonight," Spittleworth ordered Roach. "You will take a raid. We must terrify these people. They must understand that the tax isn't necessary, that any hardship their relatives are suffering is the fault of the Ickabog, not mine or the king's. Go and undo the harm you've done." The furious Major left the room, privately thinking of all the ways he'd like to hurt Spittleworth if given 10 minutes alone with him. "And you," said Spittleworth to his spies, "will report to me tomorrow whether Major Roach has done his work well enough. If the city's still whispering about starvation and penniless relations, well then, we'll have to see how Major Roach likes dungeons." So, a group of Major Roach's dark footers waited until the capital slept, then set out for the first time to make Showville believe that the Ickabog had come calling. They selected a cottage on the very edge of town that stood a little apart from its neighbors. The men who were most skillful at breaking into houses entered the cottage, where, it pains me to say, they killed the little old lady who lived there, who, you might like to know, had written several beautifully illustrated books about the fish that lived in the river Fluma. Once her body had been carried away to be buried somewhere remote, a group of men pressed 4 of Mr. Dovetail's finest carved feet into the ground around the fish expert's house, smashed up her furniture and her fish tanks, and let her specimens die, gasping on the floor. Next morning, Spittleworth's spies reported that the plan seemed to have worked. Showville, so long avoided by the fearsome Ickabog, had at last been attacked. As the Darkfooters had now perfected the art of making the tracks look natural, breaking down doors as though a gigantic monster had smashed them in, and using pointed metal tools to mimic tooth marks on wood, the Showville residents who flocked to see the poor old woman's house were entirely taken in. Young Bert Beamish stayed at the scene even after his mother had left to start cooking their supper. He was treasuring up every detail of the beast's footprints and its fang marks, the better to imagine what it would look like when at last he came face to face with the evil creature that had killed his father, because he'd by no means abandoned his ambition to avenge him. When Bert was sure he had every detail of the monster's prints memorized, he walked home, burning with fury, and shut himself up in his bedroom, where he took down his father's medals for outstanding bravery against the deadly Ickabog, and the tiny medal the king had given him after he'd fought Daisy Dovetail. The smaller medal made Bert feel sad these days. He'd never had a good as He'd never had a friend as good as Daisy since she'd left for Pluritania. But at last, he thought, she and her father were beyond the reach of the evil Ickabog. Angry tears started in Bert's eyes. He so wanted to join the Ickabog Defense Brigade. He knew he'd be a good soldier. He wouldn't even care if he died in the fight. Of course, it would be extremely upsetting for his mother if the Ickabog killed her son as well as her husband. But on the other hand, Bert would be a hero, like his father. Lost in thoughts of revenge and glory, Bert made to replace the 2 medals on the mantelpiece when the smaller of them slipped through his fingers and rolled away under the bed. Bert lay down and groped for it, but couldn't reach. He wriggled farther, under his bed, and found it at last in the farthermost, dustiest corner, along with something sharp that seemed to have been there a very long time because it was cobwebby. Bert pulled both the metal and the sharp thing out from the corner and sat up, now rather dusty himself, to examine the unknown object. By the light of his candle, he saw a tiny, perfectly carved Ickabog foot, the last remaining piece of the toy carved so long ago by Mr. Dovetail. By Cormac, age 11. Bert had thought he'd burned up every last bit of the toy, but this foot must have flown under the bed when he'd smashed up the rest of the Ichabod with his poker. He was on the point of tossing the foot onto his bedroom fire when Bert suddenly changed his mind and began to examine it more closely. Chapter 41. Mrs. Beamish's Plan. Mother, said Bert. Mrs. Beamish had been sitting at the kitchen table, mending a hole in one of Bert's sweaters and pausing occasionally to wipe her eyes. The Ichabod's attack on their Showville neighbor had brought back awful memories of the death of Major Beamish, and she'd just been thinking about that night when she'd kissed his poor, cold hand in the blue parlor at the palace, while the rest of him was hidden by the cornucopian flag. Mother, look, said Bert in a strange voice, and he set down in front of her the tiny, clawed wooden foot he'd found beneath his bed. By Abiyana, age 11. Mrs. Beamish picked it up and examined it through the spectacles she wore when sewing by candlelight. Why, it's part of that little toy you used to have, said Bert's mother. Your toy, Icka. But Mrs. Beamish didn't finish the word. Still staring at the carved foot, she remembered the monstrous footprints she and Bert had seen earlier that day in the soft ground around the house of the vanished old lady. Although much, much bigger, the shape of that foot was identical to this, as were the angles of the toes, the scales, and the long claws. For several minutes, the only sound was the sputtering of the candle as Mrs. Beamish turned the little wooden foot in her trembling fingers. It was as though a door had flown open inside her mind, a door she'd been keeping blocked and barricaded for a very long time. Ever since her husband had died, Mrs. Beamish had refused to admit a single doubt or suspicion about the Ickabog. Loyal to the king, trusting in Spittleworth, she'd believed the people who claimed the Ickabog wasn't real were traitors. But now the uncomfortable memories she tried to shut out came flooding in upon her. She remembered telling the scullery maid all about Mr. Dovetail's treasonous speech about the Ickabog, and turning to see Cankerby the footman listening in the shadows. She remembered how soon afterward the Dovetails had disappeared. She remembered the little girl who'd been jumping rope, wearing one of Daisy Dovetail's old dresses, and the bandelore she claimed her brother had been given on the same day. She thought of her cousin Harold starving, and the strange absence of mail from the north that she and all her neighbors had noticed over the past few months. She thought, too, of the sudden disappearance of Lady Eslanda, which Minnie had puzzled over. These and 100 other odd happenings added themselves together in Mrs. Beamish's mind as she gazed at the little wooden foot, and together they formed a monstrous outline that frightened her far more than the Ichabog. What, she asked herself, had really happened to her husband up on that marsh? Why hadn't she been allowed to look beneath the cornucopian flag covering his body? Horrible thoughts now tumbled on top of one another as Mrs. Beamish turned to look at her son and saw her suspicions reflected in his face. Oh my. The king can't know, she whispered. He can't. He's a good man. Even if everything else she'd believed might be wrong, Mrs. Beamish couldn't bear to give up her belief in the goodness of King Fred the Fearless. He'd always been so kind to her and Bert. Mrs. Beamish stood up, the little wooden foot clutched tightly in her hand, and laid down Bert's half-darned sweater. I'm going to see the king, she said, with a more determined look on her face than Bert had ever seen there. Now? He asked, looking out into the darkness. Night, said Mrs. Beamish. While there's a chance neither of these lords are with him. He'll see me. He's always liked me. I want to come too, said Bert, because a strange feeling of foreboding had come over him. No, said Mrs. Beamish. She approached her son, put her hand on his shoulder, and looked up into his face. Listen to me, Bert. If I'm not back from the palace in 1 hour, you're to leave Chauville, head north to Jeroboam, find Cousin Harold, and tell him everything. But, said Bert, suddenly afraid. Promise me you'll go if I'm not back in an hour, said Mrs. Beamish fiercely. I will, said Bert, but the boy, who'd earlier imagined dying a heroic death and not caring how much it upset his mother, was suddenly terrified. Mother, she hugged him briefly. You're a clever boy. Never forget you're a soldier's son, as well as a pastry chef's. Mrs. Beamish walked quickly to the door and put on her shoes. After one last smile at Bert, she slipped out into the night. Chapter 42. Behind the Curtain. The kitchens were dark and empty when Mrs. Beamish let herself in from the courtyard. Moving on tiptoe, she peeked around corners as she went, because she knew how Cankerby the footman liked to lurk in the shadows. Slowly and carefully, Mrs. Beamish made her way toward the king's private apartments, holding the little wooden foot so tightly in her hand that its sharp claws dug into her palm. At last she reached the scarlet-carpeted corridor leading to Fred's rooms. Now she could hear laughter coming from behind the doors. Mrs. Beamish rightly guessed that Fred hadn't been told about the Ickabog attack on the outskirts of Chauville, because she was sure he wouldn't be laughing if he had. However, somebody was clearly with the king, and she wanted to see Fred alone. As she stood there, wondering what was best to do, the door ahead opened. With a gasp, Mrs. Beamish dived behind a long velvet curtain and tried to stop its swaying. Fittleworth and Flapoon were laughing and joking with the king as they bade him good night. Excellent joke, your majesty. Why, I think I've split my pantaloons, guffawed Flapoon. We shall have to rechristen you King Fred Funny, sire, chuckled Fittleworth. Mrs. Beamish held her breath and tried to suck in her tummy. She heard the sound of Fred's door closing. The two lords stopped laughing at once. Blithering idiot, said Flapoon in a low voice. I've met cleverer blobs of Ickabog cheese, muttered Fittleworth. Can't you take a turn entertaining him tomorrow? Grumbled Flapoon. I'll be busy with the tax collectors until 3, said Fittleworth. But if both lords stopped talking, the footsteps also ceased. Mrs. Beamish was still holding her breath, her eyes closed, praying they hadn't noticed the bulge in the curtain. Well, good night, Fittleworth, said Flapoon's voice. Yes, sleep well, Flapoon, said Fittleworth. Very softly, her heart beating very fast, Mrs. Beamish let out her breath. It was all right. The two lords were going to bed, and yet she couldn't hear footsteps. Then, so suddenly she had no time to draw breath into her lungs, the curtain was ripped back. Before she could cry out, Flapoon's large hand had closed over her mouth, and Spittleworth had seized her wrists. The two lords dragged Mrs. Beamish out of her hiding place and down the nearest set of stairs, and while she struggled and tried to shout, she couldn't make a sound through Flapoon's thick fingers, nor could she wriggle free. At last they pulled her into that same blue parlor where she'd once kissed her dead husband's hand. "Do not scream," Bittleworth warned her, pulling out a short dagger he'd taken to wearing even inside the palace, "or the king will need a new pastry chef." He gestured to Flapoon to take his hand away from Mrs. Beamish's mouth. The first thing she did was take a gasp of breath, because she felt like fainting. "You made an outsized lump in that curtain, cook," sneered Spittleworth. "Exactly what were you doing, lurking there, so close to the king, after the kitchens have closed?" Mrs. Beamish might have made up some silly lie, of course. She could have pretended she wanted to ask King Fred what kinds of cakes he'd like her to make tomorrow. But she knew the two lords wouldn't believe her. So instead, she held out the hand clutching the Ickabog foot and opened her fingers. "I know," she said quietly, "what you're up to." The two lords moved closer and peered down at her palm and the perfect tiny replica of the huge feet the Darkfooters were using. Biddleworth and Flapoon looked at each other, and then at Mrs. Beamish, and all the pastry chef could think, when she saw their expressions, was, "Run, Bert, run!" Chapter 43. Bert and the Guard. The candle on the table beside Bert burned slowly downward, while he watched the minute hand creep around the clock's face. He told himself his mother would definitely come home soon. She'd walk in any minute, pick up his half-darned sweater as though she'd never dropped it, and tell him what had happened when she saw the king. Then the minute hand seemed to speed up, when Bert would have done anything to make it slow down. 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes left. Bert got to his feet and moved to the window. He looked up and down the dark street. There was no sign of his mother returning. But wait! His heart leapt. He seen movement on the corner. For a few shining seconds, Bert was sure he was about to see Mrs. Beamish step into the patch of moonlight, smiling as she caught sight of his anxious face at the window. And then his heart seemed to drop like a brick into his stomach. It wasn't Mrs. Beamish who was approaching, but Major Roach, accompanied by 4 large members of the Ickabog Defense Brigade, all carrying torches. Bert leapt back from the window, snatched up the sweater on the table, and sprinted through to his bedroom. He grabbed his shoes and his father's medal, forced up the bedroom window, clambered out of it, then gently slid the window closed from outside. As he dropped down into the vegetable patch, he heard Major Roach banging on the front door. Then a rough voice said, "I'll check the back." Bert threw himself flat in the earth behind a row of beetroots, smeared his fair hair with soil, and lay very still in the darkness. Through his closed eyelids he saw flickering light. A soldier held his torch high in hopes of seeing Bert running away across other people's gardens. The soldier didn't notice the earthy shape of Bert concealed behind the beetroot leaves, which threw long, swaying shadows. "Well, he hasn't gotten out this way," shouted the soldier. There was a crash, and Bert knew Roach had broken down the front door. He listened to the soldiers opening cupboards and wardrobes. Bert remained utterly still in the earth, because torchlight was still shining through his closed eyelids. "Maybe he cleared out before his mother went to the palace." "Well, We've got to find him, growled the familiar voice of Major Roach. He's the son of the Ickabog's first victim. If Bert Beamish starts telling the world the monster's a lie, people will listen. Spread out and search. He can't have gotten far, and if you catch him, said Roach, as his men's heavy footsteps sounded across the Beamish's wooden floorboards, kill him. We'll work out our stories later. Bert lay completely flat and still, listening to the men running away up and down the street, and then a cool part of Bert's brain said, "Move!" He put his father's medal around his neck, pulled on the half-darned sweater, and snatched up his shoes, then began to crawl through the earth until he reached a neighboring fence, where he tunneled out enough dirt to let him wriggle beneath it. He kept crawling until he reached a cobbled street. He could still hear the soldiers' voices echoing through the night as they banged on doors, demanding to search houses, asking people whether they'd seen Bert Beamish, the pastry chef's son. He heard himself described as a dangerous traitor. Bert took another handful of earth and smeared it over his face. Then he got to his feet and, crouching low, darted into a dark doorway across the street. A soldier ran past, but Bert was now so filthy that he was well camouflaged against the dark door, and the man noticed nothing. When the soldier had disappeared, Bert ran barefooted from doorway to doorway, carrying his shoes, hiding in shadowy alcoves, and edging ever closer to the city within the city gates. However, when he drew near, he saw a guard keeping watch, and before Bert could think of a plan, he had to slide behind a statue of King Richard the Righteous, because Roach and another soldier were approaching. "Have you seen Bert Beamish?" they shouted at the guard. "What, the pastry chef's son?" asked the man. Roach seized the front of the man's uniform and shook him as a terrier shakes a rabbit. "Of course, the pastry chef's son. Have you let him through these gates? Tell me." "No, I haven't," said the guard. "And what's the boy done to have you lot chasing him?" "He's a traitor," snarled Roach, "and I'll personally shoot anybody who helps him. Understood?" "Understood," said the guard. Roach released the man, and he and his companion ran off again, their torches casting swinging pools of light on all the walls until they were swallowed once more by the darkness. Bert watched the guard straighten his uniform and shake his head. Bert hesitated, then, knowing this might cost him his life, crept out of his hiding place. So thoroughly had Bert camouflaged himself with all the earth that the guard didn't realize anyone was beside him until he saw the white of Bert's eyes in the moonlight and let out a yelp of terror. "No! Please," whispered Bert. "Please, don't give me away. I need to get out of here." From beneath his sweater, he pulled his father's heavy silver medal, brushed earth from its surface, and showed the guard. "I'll give you this. It's real silver. If you just let me out through the gates, and don't tell anyone you've seen me." "I'm not a traitor," said Bert. "I haven't betrayed anyone, I swear." The guard was an older man with a stiff gray beard. He considered the earth-covered Bert for a moment or two before saying, "Keep your medal, son." He opened the gate just wide enough for Bert to slide through. "Thank you," gasped Bert. "Stick to the back road," advised the guard, "and trust no one. Good luck." Chapter 44. Mrs. Beamish Fights Back. While Bert was slipping out of the city gates, Mrs. Beamish was being shunted into a cell in the dungeons by Lord Spittleworth. A cracked, reedy voice nearby sang the national anthem in time to hammer blows. "Be quiet!" bellowed Spittleworth toward the wall. The singing stopped. "When I finish this foot, my lord," said the broken voice, "will you let me out to see my daughter?" Yes, yes, you'll see your daughter, Spittleworth called back, rolling his eyes. Now be quiet, because I want to talk to your neighbor.
Well, before you get started, my lord, said Mrs. Beamish, I've got a few things I want to say to you. Spittleworth and Flapoon stared at the plump little woman. Never had they placed anyone in the dungeons who looked so proud and unconcerned at being slung in this dank, cool place. Spittleworth was reminded of Lady Eslanda, who was still shut up in his library and still refusing to marry him. He never imagined a cook could look as haughty as a lady. Firstly, said Mrs. Beamish, if you kill me, the king will know. He'll notice I'm not making his pastries. You can taste the difference.
That's true, said Spittleworth with a cruel smile. However, as the king will believe that you've been killed by the Ickabog, he'll simply have to get used to his pastries tasting different, won't he?
My house lies in the shadow of the palace walls, countered Mrs. Beamish. It will be impossible to take an Ichabod attack there without waking up 100 witnesses.
That's easily solved, said Spittleworth. We'll say you were foolish enough to take a nighttime stroll down by the banks of the river Fluma, where the Ickabog was having a drink.
Which might have worked, said Mrs. Beamish, making up a story off the top of her head, if I hadn't let certain instructions to be carried out if word gets out I've been killed by the Ichabog.
What instructions? And whom have you given them to? What instructions? And whom have you given them to? Said Flapoon. Her son, I dare say, said Spittleworth. He'll soon be in our power. Make a note, Flapoon. We only kill the cook once we've killed her son.
In the meantime, said Mrs. Beamish, pretending she hadn't felt an icy stab of terror at the thought of Bert falling into Spittleworth's hands, you might as well equip this cell properly with a stove and all my regular implements, so I can keep making cakes for the king.
Yes, why not? Said Spittleworth slowly. We all enjoy your pastries, Mrs. Beamish. You may continue to cook for the king until your son is caught.
Good, said Mrs. Beamish, but I'm going to need assistance. I suggest I train up some of my fellow prisoners who can at least whisk the egg whites and line my baking trays. That will require you to feed the poor fellows a little more. I noticed as you marched me through here that some of them look like skeletons. I can't have them eating all my raw ingredients because they're starving. And lastly, said Mrs. Beamish, giving her cell a sweeping glance, I shall need a comfortable bed and some clean blankets if I'm to get enough sleep to produce cakes of the quality the king demands. It's his birthday coming up, too. He'll be expecting something very special. Spittleworth eyed this most surprising captive for a moment or two, then said,
Doesn't it alarm you, madam, to think that you and your child will soon be dead?
Oh, if there's one thing you can learn at cookery school, said Mrs. Beamish with a shrug, burnt crusts and soggy bases happen to the best of us. Roll up your sleeves and start something else, I say. No point moaning over what you can't fix. As Spittleworth couldn't think of a good retort to this, he beckoned to Flapoon, and the two lords left the cell, the door clanging shut behind them. As soon as they'd gone, Mrs. Beamish stopped pretending to be brave and dropped down onto the hard bed, which was the only piece of furniture in the cell. She was shaking all over, and for a moment she was afraid that she was going to have hysterics. However, a woman didn't rise to be in charge of the king's kitchen in a city of the finest pastry makers on earth without being able to manage her own nerves. Mrs. Beamish took a deep steadying breath, and then, hearing the reedy voice next door break into the national anthem again, pressed her ear to the wall and began to listen for the place where the noise was coming into her cell. At last she found a crack near the ceiling. Standing on her bed, she called softly, "Dan- Daniel Dovetail, I know that's you. This is Bertha Beamish." But the broken voice only continued to sing. Mrs. Beamish sank back down on her bed, wrapped her arms around herself, closed her eyes, and prayed with every part of her aching heart that wherever Bert was, he was safe. Chapter 45. Bert and Jeroboam. At first, Bert didn't realize that the whole of Cornucopia had been warned by Lord Spittleworth to watch out for him. Following the guard's advice at the city gates, he kept to country lanes and back roads. He'd never been as far north as Jeroboam, but by roughly following the course of the river Fluma, he knew he must be traveling in the right direction. Hair matted and shoes clogged with mud, he walked across plowed fields and slept in ditches. Not until he sneaked into Kurdsburg on the third night to try and find something to eat did he come face to face for the first time with a picture of himself on a wanted poster, taped up in a cheesemonger's window. Luckily, the drawing of a neat, smiling young man looked nothing like the reflection of the grubby tramp he saw staring out of the dark glass beside it. By Natalie, age 11. Nevertheless, it was a shock to see that there was a reward of 100 ducats on his head, dead or alive. Bert hurried on through the dark streets, passing skinny dogs and boarded up windows. Once or twice he came across other grubby, ragged people who were also foraging in bins. At last he managed to retrieve a lump of hard and slightly moldy cheese before anyone else could grab it. After taking a drink of rainwater from a barrel behind a disused dairy, he hurried back out of Kurdsburg and returned to the country roads. All the time he walked, Bert's thoughts kept scurrying back to his mother. "They won't kill her," he told himself over and over again. "They'll never kill her. She's the king's favorite servant. They wouldn't dare." He had to block the possibility of his mother's death from his mind, because if he thought she'd gone, he knew he might not have the strength to get out of the next ditch he slept in. Bert's feet soon blistered because he was walking miles out of his way to avoid meeting other people. The next night he stole the last few rotting apples from an orchard, and the night after that he took the carcass of a chicken from somebody's dustbin and gnawed off the last few scraps of meat. By the time he saw the dark gray outline of Jeroboam on the horizon, he'd had to steal a length of twine from a blacksmith's yard to use as a belt, because he'd lost so much weight that his trousers were falling down. All through his journey, Bert told himself that if he could only find Cousin Harold, everything would be all right. He'd lay down his troubles at the feet of a grown-up, and Harold would sort everything out. Bert lurked outside the city walls until it was growing dark, then limped into the wine-making city, his blisters now hurting terribly, and headed for Harold's tavern. There were no lights in the window, and when Bert drew near, he saw why. The doors and windows had all been boarded up. The tavern had gone out of business, and Harold and his family seemed to have left. "Please," the desperate Bert asked a passing woman, "can you tell me where Harold's gone? Harold, who used to own this tavern?" "Harold," said the woman. "Oh, he went south a week ago. He's got relatives down in Showville. He's hoping to get a job with the king. Stunned, Bert watched the woman walk away into the night. A chilly wind blew around him, and out of the corner of his eye he saw one of his own wanted posters fluttering on a nearby lantern post. Exhausted and with no idea what to do next, he imagined sitting down on this cold doorstep and simply waiting for the soldiers to find him. It was then he felt the point of a sword at his back, and a voice in his ear said, "That's you.